Have you ever stopped to think that the Bible you know might just be an edited version of history? What you received as the Word of God was, in fact, filtered, selected, and approved by men. Men with political agendas, power struggles, and specific visions of what should or shouldn't be considered sacred. The current Christian Bible, whether Catholic or Protestant, didn't fall from the sky fully formed. It was shaped over centuries, and many texts considered sacred by early Christians were deliberately excluded. Who were the people who decided what you should read? Why were certain books banned while others were elevated to divine status? Imagine that in the first centuries after Jesus, there were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of Gospels, letters, and sacred texts circulating among Christian communities. Some portrayed Jesus as a spiritual teacher who taught inner enlightenment. Others delivered explosive revelations that challenged the forming structure of religious power. But in the end, only 27 books made it into the New Testament. Who decided that? The answer involves politics, suppression of ideas, and a battle for control of the spiritual narrative. What you're about to discover is that the Bible wasn't simply revealed, it was constructed. The earliest followers of Jesus did not have a unified sacred book. They moved among communities scattered across the Roman Empire, each with its own traditions and writings considered inspired. Gospels, such as those of Thomas, Philip, and Mary Magdalene, were read alongside what we now call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What few people know is that this diversity of texts reflected a diversity of understandings about who Jesus was and what his central message meant. While some groups emphasized the crucifixion and resurrection, others saw Christ as a master of inner wisdom, whose teachings led to self-knowledge and spiritual liberation. Historical fragments reveal that many of these alternative texts were just as popular as the canonical ones in the early centuries. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, contains sayings of Jesus that don't appear in the traditional Bible, including the provocative statement, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." This plurality began to be seen as a threat when Christian leaders sought to consolidate a single authorized version of the faith. The process was not peaceful. It involved the burning of manuscripts, excommunications, and accusations of heresy against those who preserved forbidden writings. As Christianity grew, a silent battle unfolded behind the scenes of religious power. Have you ever imagined that the one truth preached today was decided amid intense theological conflicts? In the 2nd century, figures like Irenaeus of Lyon and Tertullian began defining what would be considered orthodoxy and what would be condemned as heresy. The criteria were not as spiritual as one might think. Many decisions depended on alignment with the churches that held the most prestige, Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, compatibility with the hierarchical structure that was forming political usefulness in unifying the Roman Empire in crisis. The Gnostics, for example, were persecuted not because their teachings were false, but because they preached that salvation came through inner knowledge, gnosis, not clerical mediation. This threatened the emerging power of the bishops. Documents like Ptolemy's letter to Flora reveal how these groups had sophisticated theological systems, entirely different from what the official church would allow. The most shocking part: many texts labeled as heretical contained teachings that today would be seen as deeply spiritual. But in the struggle for control over souls, diversity had to be eliminated. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD has become a myth distorted by popular culture. Many believe that this was where the Bible was assembled by vote, as if the bishops chose the sacred books in a divine election. The truth is more complex and revealing that Constantine, the first Christian emperor, convened the council primarily to resolve the Arian crisis, a dispute over the divine nature of Jesus, not to define the biblical canon. However, this event marked the beginning of a dangerous alliance between throne and altar that would shape Christianity forever. Historical documents show that no official list of biblical books was decided at Nicaea. Imperial power began to fund and control official copies of the scriptures. Bishops allied with the government gained precedence over independent voices. The irony: many texts now considered apocryphal were publicly read in 4th century churches, while several canonical books, such as Revelation, still faced strong resistance. Canonization was a slow process of imposed authority, not a celestial revelation. Constantine did not convert to Christianity out of faith, but as a political strategy. The Roman Empire was fragmented, and he saw the growing Christian community as a powerful unifying force. His conversion marked the moment when genuine spirituality began to be co-opted by state control. The emperor ordered the production of 50 luxurious Bibles on parchment, distributed to the major churches. For the first time in history, there was an official version of the scriptures, copied under imperial supervision. This set a dangerous precedent. Texts that contradicted the official version were destroyed. Scribes received specific instructions on how to translate controversial passages. Church doctrine became the law of the empire. Did you know Constantine retained his title of Pontifex Maximus, chief pagan priest, even after declaring himself Christian? His vision was clear. Christianity was to be a state religion, not a path of spiritual liberation. The bishops who aligned with this project gained worldly power in exchange for silencing dissenting voices. The apocryphal Gospels reveal a Christianity radically different from the one you know. While the canonical Bible was meticulously preserved, texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and the Gospel of Judas were buried in the Egyptian desert for centuries, until accidental discoveries brought them to light in the 20th century. What do these forbidden documents contain? Gospel of Thomas, 1:4t. Secret sayings of Jesus, including "The kingdom of God is within you," a message of inner awakening that challenged ecclesiastical hierarchy. Gospel of Mary portrays Mary Magdalene as the most advanced disciple, to whom Jesus taught profound mysteries, a narrative that contradicts the marginalization of women in the church. Gospel of Judas presents Judas not as a traitor, but as the disciple who understood the cosmic plan, a perspective that destabilized redemption theology. Archaeologists estimate that less than 1% of early Christian texts survived systematic destruction. Each recovered fragment shows us how much was lost and how much may still be hidden in secret libraries or unexplored archaeological sites. The Gnostics represented a spiritual movement that the emerging church made a point to erase from history. Their teachings revealed that salvation comes from self-knowledge, gnosis, not from rituals or hierarchies. The God of the Old Testament was not the true Father mentioned by Jesus. Each human being contains a divine spark capable of awakening. Texts like the Apocryphon of John describe a complex cosmos where archons, oppressive forces, keep humanity trapped in illusion, a concept that eerily echoes the modern idea of the Matrix. The tragic irony: many practices we now associate with esoteric Christianity, meditation, the pursuit of inner enlightenment, recognition of personal divinity, were precisely what the Gnostics practiced and what were later declared heretical. Saint Irenaeus, in his book Against Heresies, admitted that the Gnostics possessed deeper teachings about God, but that depth was precisely the problem. A spirituality that dispensed with intermediaries did not serve the interests of the nascent ecclesiastical institution. The biblical canon, as we know it today, was formalized through a slow political process, not by divine intervention. Between the 4th and 5th centuries, different regional councils proposed conflicting lists of inspired books. The final version you hold in your hands was decided based on 3 main factors: geopolitical consensus. Bishops from the most powerful centers, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, imposed their preferences. Doctrinal control. Texts that supported the hierarchical structure were prioritized. Imperial standardization. The Roman state needed a single official version to manage its Christianized empire. The councils of Hippo, 393 AD, and Carthage, 397 AD, are often cited as key moments in defining the canon. However, historical records show that several canonical books, such as Hebrews and Revelation, still generated intense controversy. Texts now considered apocryphal, like 1 Clement, were read as inspired in many churches. The final list was only truly consolidated in the 7th century, after repeated impositions by Rome. The manipulation of sacred texts went far beyond the mere selection of books. It involved subtle alterations by scribes over the centuries. Scholars like Bart Ehrman have identified more than 400,000 textual variants in the manuscripts of the New Testament. Some changes were accidental, but others reveal clear doctrinal intentions. The adulterous woman, John 7:53 to 8:11. This famous passage does not appear in the oldest manuscripts and was added centuries later. The Trinity in 1 John 5:7 to 8. The so-called Johannine comma was a medieval addition to strengthen the doctrine of the Trinity, Mark 16:9 to 20. The final verses about handling snakes were added after the original abruptly ended at verse 8. The most revealing case is that of the Gospel of Mark. Its original ending, which does not mention appearances of the resurrected Christ, was considered so problematic that scribes created 3 different endings to correct the text. These alterations show how the Bible was gradually shaped to fit the dominant theology of each era. The suppression of female voices in the Christian tradition was not accidental. It was systematic. Historical evidence reveals that at least 29 texts attributed to women circulated in the early Christian communities. Women held leadership, roles as deaconesses, prophetesses, and even apostles. The Gospel of Mary portrays Mary Magdalene as the bearer of secret teachings unknown to Peter. The transformation of Mary Magdalene from apostle of the apostles to repentant prostitute occurred through textual manipulation. Passages about female leaders were softened or removed. Pseudepigraphy, letters falsely attributed to Paul, like 1 Timothy 2:12, prohibited women from teaching. Deliberate iconography, artistic fusion of Magdalene with other female figures to create the sinner narrative. The apocryphal Acts of Paul and Thecla reveals how a female disciple defied gender norms, baptizing and preaching. This text was declared heretical precisely because it threatened the patriarchal structure that was taking hold. The Bible became the most powerful instrument of social control in Western history. Through the monopoly of the scriptures, the church established control of truth. Only clergy were allowed to interpret sacred texts, divine justification. And for hierarchies, selected passages supported the authority of kings and popes, suppression of dissent. Any questioning was treated as heresy, the Latin Vulgate. The official translation made by Jerome in the 5th century became a tool of domination. Access to the original Greek and Hebrew texts was restricted. Vernacular translations were forbidden for centuries. Ordinary readers were dependent on clerical mediation. The case of the Waldensians is emblematic. This 12th century movement was exterminated for translating the Bible into Provençal and preaching it without ecclesiastical authorization. The message was clear. The scriptures were not meant to be understood, but obeyed. The archaeological discoveries of the 20th century tore through the veil of the official history. In 1945, an Egyptian farmer stumbled upon the Nag Hammadi codices, a Gnostic library buried in the desert in the 4th century, to escape destruction. These texts revealed 52 early Christian writings completely different from the canonical ones, secret teachings of Jesus on enlightenment and self-knowledge, alternative visions of creation that challenged the traditional Genesis narrative. Meanwhile, the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, showed that Judaism in Jesus' time was far more diverse than previously imagined. Many ideas later attributed to Christianity already existed in earlier Jewish sects. The writing of the Old Testament underwent significant manipulation. These discoveries prove that the spiritual history of humanity is infinitely richer and more controversial than official versions have allowed us to believe. Why was this historical truth so meticulously hidden? The answer lies in 3 pillars of control. Temporal power. A unified religion was essential for governing empires. Ecclesiastical revenue. Salvation mediated through sacraments. Created institutional dependence. Cognitive dominance. People who question their sacred scriptures also question their rulers. The Vatican archives contain thousands of documents never released to the public. Scholars estimate that only 1% of the texts from the Library of Alexandria survived the burnings. The Inquisition destroyed more heretical books than all of antiquity. To this day, important codices remain under restricted access. 4th century account by Bishop Athanasius reveals the strategy. We must eliminate all unauthorized writings so that no one can come into contact with them. This historical blackout was no accident. It was religious state policy. The journey through these hidden truths may be unsettling, but it is also liberating. Every recovered fragment of history reminds us that human spirituality is far too vast to be contained by any institution or sacred book. The early Christians preserved a powerful wisdom that the divine dwells within each consciousness, not in pages controlled by men. This flame of direct knowledge, the gnosis so feared by the powerful, can never be fully extinguished. Take a deep breath. You don't need to reject the entire tradition, but rather reinterpret it. The true heresy is not to question, but to accept passively. Every archaeological discovery, every recovered text is an invitation to rewrite your own spiritual journey, not as a spectator, but as the protagonist. May these revelations not so revolt, but instead a calm determination to seek beyond the obvious. The matrix of religious control is already cracking, and the light escaping through those fractures illuminates paths our spiritualist ancestors once knew well. Awakening is not the destruction of faith, but the rediscovery of its purest essence. Free, personal, and non-transferable. This video didn't appear to you by accident. You might be awakening, and I'm here to guide you on that journey. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning.